This video is sponsored by SKILLSHARE. Roll the intro. We recently had the opportunity to get our cold, sweaty little hands on the soon-to-be-released Canon C400.
Yeah, we're lucky boys!
Calm down. This camera is hotly anticipated, and both Taylor and myself have been waiting to see what it can do. Now, before we start, we only had the camera for about 3 hours, so we had to be very selective with the testing that we were able to do. And so we went for the thing that I think we all want to know. Everyone understands what Canon images look like, but how does the dynamic range compare to the C500 Mark II, C300 Mark III, and the C70, and how does the high ISO noise perform compared to the FX6? Along with that, I've used the Canon C500 Mark II for nearly 3 years, so I'll give you an overview of what's changed, and we'll also talk about Taylor's perspectives being a long-term FX6 user, because we feel that this is Canon's direct competitor to that camera. Now, do be aware that our tests were quick and nasty. They certainly don't look pretty, but I'm pleased to say that we were able to get to the bottom of our questions pretty quickly, and we have the answers for you if you stick around. But first, a big thanks to Canon, The ACS, Team Digital, and Elliot Nieves for getting us the camera, Limitless Studios for lending us their C500 Mark II and lenses, as well as cinemachine.com.au for providing extra equipment and allowing us to shoot our tests at their workshop. Before we jump into the tests, let's have a quick look at some of the features of this camera. We're not going to cover everything here, just the stuff that we find the most interesting. If you want a more detailed overview, we'll link to the fantastic video by the chaps over at CVP down below. Now before we start, this is a pre-production camera, and as far as we know, it's the only one available in the Oceania region, which is pretty cool. It is running pre-production firmware, so things might change, and we did actually encounter one software glitch during our testing. The C400 uses the same image processor found in the C500 Mark II, the C300 Mark III, and the C70, so that should give us a good idea of what to expect. It has a full-frame 6K sensor, and it can shoot true cinema 24p and full-frame 6K RAW at up to 59 frames per second in 16 or 17:9 aspect ratios internally. It also offers a cropped Super 35 4K at up to 120 frames in RAW and 180 frames in HD if you crop in even more. If you don't need RAW, you can actually get a full-frame version of the 4K 120p in Canon's excellent implementation of XF-AVC, but do keep in mind that the non-RAW 4K is only oversampled from the 6K sensor until you go over 60 frames, until it gets pixel binned or line skipped. And you do have to use Canon's 12-bit Canon Cinema RAW Lite if you want to shoot at any resolution above 4K. Canon Cinema RAW Lite isn't the best or worst RAW that I've personally used, and the file size can still be fairly beefy. But with that said, the camera does offer several compression ratios though, with RAW LQ getting you over 100 minutes runtime in 6K 25 frames per second on a 512GB card, which is a really good showing, and the camera can record larger files and proxy simultaneously as well. The camera has 3 base ISOs, starting at 800, 3200, and then 12800. The first and last ISO matches the FX6 and 3. We found that the C400 did have cleaner shadows than the FX6 at both ISO 800 and 12800, and the shadows did seem to have more color information. Colors also seem to be more accurate than the FX6, and blacks seem to be deeper. Now we do want to mention that we did cycle through all 3 native ISOs on the C400, and while they do get a little bit noisier, the dynamic range does seem to hold up quite well. We also did find that while both cameras do seem to lose a little bit of latitude when you go to the second native ISO, the Canon did hold up better. I'd personally have no issue shooting here at 12,800 on the C400 and delivering without denoising, whereas on the Sony I'd probably want to do a noise pass in post before passing it to a client. We don't want to spend too much more time talking about specs, but overall we do feel that the camera is well situated for documentary, corporate, and some TVC work. Like other Canon cinema cameras, despite the name, we don't see this being popular for large team cinema projects. The camera is compact and more designed for run-and-gun operation with all the controls operator side rather than for large teams with multiple pairs of hands on the camera at the same time. That being said, there's nothing technically stopping you from using it for cinema, and should be great for projects that require more nimble operation. On paper, the camera has specs that rival or beat $50,000 cameras that are being used for cinema, but it comes in at just 13,500 Aussie dollars, which is very aggressively priced for Canon. Excuse me, we just need to jump in to talk about this video's sponsor, SKILLSHARE. SKILLSHARE is an awesome online learning community with thousands of classes on everything from filmmaking to graphic design and even productivity hacks. We've recently been taking the creative writing bootcamp class called Start a New Story with Milo Goldberg, who is a professional novelist, and we've really been enjoying it so far. As filmmakers, storytelling is at the heart of everything that we do, and this class really helps sharpen those skills. Plus, as filmmakers, it's so important that we never really stop learning and growing in our craft. The class has been super engaging, and the instructors are industry professionals who share their real-world experiences. Plus, you get to create and share projects along the way, which is a great way to get feedback and improve. If you're looking to up your storytelling game, we highly recommend checking it out. And here's a little bonus. The first 500 people to use our link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. If it is your summer to our friends on the other side of the world, or winter if you're on our side, it is the perfect time to explore new skills and passions. Whether it's refining your storytelling or learning new filmmaking techniques, or diving into animation, Skillshare has something for everyone. Alright, let's get back into the video. But seriously, do think about giving Skillshare a try. You might just find your next creative obsession. Now let's attempt to answer some of the questions that you might have. To start with, the build and ergonomics are good. I expected the camera to feel like a slightly smaller C400, but to be honest, both Taylor and myself felt it compared better to the FX6. It's just bigger in some areas and smaller in others. It's not all positives though. The top handle is lacking function buttons, which would have been nice to see, and the screws securing it to the body feel cheap, similar to how many of Canon's RF mount L-series lenses feel cheaper to the touch than you'd expect given their price. So if you do buy this camera, we would recommend replacing the top handle with a third-party one. Unfortunately, you can't do the same with their lenses because Canon still have their lawyers keeping full-frame RF autofocus lenses on lockdown. Best grab an EF adapter.
Damn!
Another minor annoyance that I had is that Canon have moved the audio knobs to the operator side of the camera. I've often been shooting with my left hand on the lens pulling focus and my right hand on the volume dials adjusting gain during interviews, and having everything operator side makes things feel a little bit cluttered for my liking, and the fact that we've sacrificed one of the CF Express card slots to squeeze the audio dials onto this side of the camera is frankly disappointing. We'd also like to mention that Canon does make their own RF to PL mount adapter, and it does have electronic communication for Cook eye data. However, even with that electronic communication, it's still one of the most expensive PL to RF mount adapters on the market, so we'd probably recommend picking up a third party. Now in this camera, compared to the C500 Mark II and the C70, there have been two pretty cool software additions. The first of which is a setting that allows you to tweak how the digital stabilization works. Canon's digital stabilization has been pretty good on their other cameras, but occasionally it can get stuck on a subject and cause strange warping or lurching as the subject is engaged and disengaged from the tracking. You can now enable and disable that specific part of the tracking data, which makes it supposedly a lot better. We haven't had quite enough time to test this, but we didn't see any issues so far. The other thing that they've added is an automatic flicker detection, which is useful for flashing lights, flickering lights, televisions, and working with LED walls. The feature does seem to work well, but we would say to not leave it set to automatic all of the time. Sometimes the camera would de-flicker parts of the scene that were not flickering, which meant that it introduced flickering into the image. This just means that if you're not sure, maybe leave it turned off until Canon can update the software. We don't think it's a huge deal, we just don't think that it's a feature that you should leave enabled all the time. Next, the screen is a lot smaller than the screens on previous Canon cameras. You also feel the difference a lot more because it has large black borders around it, making it look like a tiny box within a box. But that does bring us into another interesting talking point: Canon's built-in LUTs. They're very contrasty. To Canon's credit, you can map different LUTs to any of the outputs, and they don't have to be the same at the same time. You can also install your own LUTs, but we think Canon could do better here to give us a LUT for monitoring that's more true to the amount of information you're actually gathering. When you're on set, it looks like you're clipping highlights and shadows when in reality you aren't, and we ran into the same issue when monitoring on a small HD monitor as well. This has been an issue that I've run into with Canons and cameras from other manufacturers. But with the extra contrasty screen, it is at its worst here on the C400. We also think that this could be a great opportunity for Canon to introduce some creator looks, similar to Panasonic's VariCam look library or Arri's new looks feature, for those who don't like the warm, smooth, and nostalgic images that Canon are known to produce right out of camera. It is a nice look to be sure, but it's not to everyone's taste and it won't suit every project. Another area that we think that Canon can improve is in autofocus. I've personally never found the C500 Mark II autofocus to be good enough to rely on for professional use, and it's really weird that they don't seem to put the AF capabilities of cameras like the R5 into the C500 Mark II. From the quick testing with the 24-105 f2.8, we found that the C400 has improved a lot and it is very usable, but it still doesn't quite match Sony's autofocus. It can still be slow to react and unsure of itself when subjects are further away, and we'd like to see more work done here from Canon. One other thing that I do want to mention is that the camera does, contrary to earlier statements we've heard, have a sensor that's taller than 17:9 or 16:9. We don't know if it's a full 3.2 in height, we suspect it probably is, but it would be nice to see a recording mode introduced that takes advantage of the sensor's full height. Canon is very close to having a camera here that does it all at a very compelling price for many owner-operators. Now, we don't have the physical tools required to properly test the technical dynamic range of cameras, but we can still do some rough latitude tests by exposing a subject at the camera's native ISO and stopping down the lens or opening it up to over or underexpose one stop at a time and seeing where each camera becomes unusable. And that's exactly what we've done here. When under and overexposed, all of the Canon cameras performed very similarly, and in XFAVC, all three Canons have very similar highlight performance, but the C70 does have the cleanest shadows across the board. The C400 does have cleaner shadows than the C500 Mark II, but not really by a large amount, and ultimately all three will still have a great image regardless. In RAW, we found that the C70 was still the least noisy, and the C400 still had less noise than the C500 Mark II, and it was able to clean up using far less noise reduction. Overall, we're very happy with these results, even if we did hope to see a little bit more. But I guess we'll have to wait for the full-frame dual-gain output sensor to really rock the boat. But at the end of the day, that puts the C400 in a pretty good spot. It's really up there with the C500, and it's maybe got a little bit more in the shadows, but I think that really depends on how you look at it. In the meantime, we have a very solid performance here, and it's up at the top of the chart of the best sensors that we would consider affordable instead of just rentable. Next, we want to get back to talking about this camera in comparison to the Sony FX6. As we mentioned, we think that this is Canon's direct response to that camera. After Taylor, who is a long-term FX6 user, had a play with this camera, he said that it's a better camera than the FX6 in almost every way outside of autofocus. It's got more resolution, more dynamic range, better color straight out of camera, and a more flexible codec. It has 12-bit internal RAW, false color, internal digital stabilization which works well, 10 stops of ND, a middle point base ISO of 3200, which has always been an issue on the FX6 when shooting indoors, where 800 is not bright enough and 12800 is too bright and worse performing. Most importantly though, it has a nicer noise performance at the high ISO. And all of this for only slightly more money. Canon has made a far better, more usable camera for 90% of operators, and it'll be interesting to see how Sony responds. With that said, we think Canon should also put out an FX3 competitor.
We have IBIS.
With the same sensor as the C400 and a few of the same specs, because people are going to need a B cam or a gimbal camera to pair up with the C400. Given it has more resolution, it could also be a much better hybrid camera than the FX3 is, so you can shoot video and photo at the same time with fewer compromises. With the C400, Canon now have what I think we can pretty safely say is the most tempting camera under 20,000 Australian dollars, but they don't have a compelling run-and-gun hybrid B cam that shoots the same log profile with the same native ISOs. And I think that you'd be crazy not to acknowledge how popular the FX3 and FX6 combination of cameras is. They should also probably think about including a camera that can shoot Opengate for anamorphic, but more importantly for social media filming, because shooting taller images and reframing is only going to become more popular going forward. We'd also like to see all manufacturers start including 32-bit float audio in their cameras. If our cheap little lapel mics can do it, our cinema cameras should too. That is about it for now. This is shaping up to be a very promising time for new cameras, and being a guy like me who's gotten about as much out of my S1H as I can, I'm pretty much all for it. If you have any other questions that we didn't answer, leave a comment and we'll try our best to answer them for you. Like and subscribe, follow us on the handles below, and we'll see you next time.
Playing with the C400 shots and angles.